Welcome to the Lisa Show Book Club. I'm really excited. Today I'm joined by Carina, and this is part one of our conversation about Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together, that we're reading for the book club, where we're covering chapters 1 and 2. So we're kicking it off, and I'm really excited to have you here to talk about this really interesting book. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun to read.
Okay, so there's so much to talk about right as we get right into the book, because Sherry really lays out the entire kind of argument or arc about the book. It's really, really great. And one of the reasons why we chose at the Lisa Show to read this book Alone Together, to go along with our series of Your Life on the Internet, is to really be able to take a look at where we've been, to be able to make some predictions about where we might be going in the future. So right off from the very beginning, we see that we get a little bit of a history lesson about, where we have been going. And we were laughing at the very beginning. It talks about different, 30 years ago, people who had home computers were considered hobbyists.
Yeah.
And how much everything has changed in the past 30 years, and how that network is changing parenting and communication patterns and everything. And even though the book hasn't been written like right now, a few years ago, so much has changed since then, but it's still so pertinent to our day. So I'd love to know what your initial reaction to the beginning of this book was.
Yeah, so I'll have to tell you, I was a little skeptical going into the book because as somebody who's been online essentially nearly for 30 years. That's a little embarrassing to say.
Yeah, a computer hobbyist.
Yeah, a computer hobbyist. At least my parents were. They had computers. They were bringing home computers in the 80s to do their work. And so, I've been around computers for a decent part of my childhood, and my entire adulthood has essentially been lived online. And I was a little nervous about reading this book because so often people come to the technology space with no real understanding of where we've come from or how things have developed. Mm-hmm. And Sherry really knows her stuff. I was so impressed that she actually was one of the students in the 60s and 70s who was at MIT and was playing around with Eliza, which was the first bot, essentially, that was purpose-built for to be a therapy bot, essentially, to kind of help people deal with their feelings. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, the 60s, the 70s, yeah this stuff has existed for a long time.
I was surprised to hear that. I had no idea.
Yeah, it was really one of the first AI things that was interfacing with humans for us to start playing around with and starting to build things that mirrored our own human experiences and emotions. And so immediately I was like, oh, she knows exactly what she's doing. She's been here. I'm in. I really want to hear what she has to say.
Yeah, and I love that she takes us on that journey because I'd never been explained to it that way. The way that I have seen robots and technology is my love of science fiction as a young girl and reading a lot of that.
Yeah.
And so that was my point of connection of saying, oh, we've actually really developed a lot of these things already, and I didn't know that. I right from the get-go, in the introduction, she talks about how face-to-face conversations are messy. And first of all, the first robots, the first kind of computers and technology, the reason that we are drawn to it and love it is because it seems to make that communication easier.
I mean,
less messy.
That thing of that really human feeling of, okay, I have to have a conversation with another human. What am I going to say? What are they going to say? How am I going to respond? Do I have something that I need to talk to somebody about, or do I need to express a feeling? And that the point of the author bringing up that it is so human of us to want to reduce those friction points.
Yes.
And that is the thing that a robot often offers us, is that a frictionless relationship, a thing where we don't have to get in and get nervous or expose ourselves or be vulnerable, that this thing is going to make up that difference for us and smooth those friction points and what it's like to build relationships with people.
Right from the get-go, I was like, but do I relate to this? Like, would I buy a robot? Would I be at the first one that was like, and I think, well, I have a robot vacuum cleaner, like any, my little kids had like little robot dogs and little robot cats and stuff because I was allergic. And, but I think that kind of conversation, the more that I was reading, I was thinking, oh yeah, isn't this what we expect from social media? Isn't this what we expect from texting? We're using technology, maybe not in like a formal robot setting, but we're using it to sort of shortcut that communication process. I love, she says, does it keep its human value if done by a machine? That is the cautionary message at the heart of this book. So once we start having the conversations of what we want machines to take care of, then does it keep its value? So right from the get-go, we talk about how when we think about robots, and Isaac Asimov wrote this in I, Robot, which is one of my favorite books. The very first short story is about a robot taking care of a little girl.
Yeah.
We always talk about it in terms of caregiving.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to like what you thought about that when you read that.
It's so fascinating because we want that aspect of both caregiving and giving care are some of the first things that we wanted to experiment with when it comes to robots. And, Sherry talks in the book about, that first generation of like robot toys, the Tamagotchis, the Furbies, those things that we gave to children for children to care for. And they're caring for these robots. And it was so fascinating to me because I think the author comes from maybe a different place and time than I did. And I remember Tamagotchis. I was a little old for them.
Yeah, my kids love them.
But
Or they did.
Or exactly. Or my younger siblings would have loved them. And so I looked at them at the time. I'm like, well, it's just dumb. It's just a thing that you like play with, right?
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that like we had these things that we cared for and were responsible for raising, like a Furby, and teaching them language and interacting with them and, having them respond to us, actually performing care on them. But do you still have your Furby today? Are you still like feeding your Tamagotchi today? I mean, a lot of those Tamagotchis are 20 years old at this point?
Yeah.
I read somebody like a couple months ago saying, I went back to my parents' house to visit after being away. And oh my goodness, look, there was the Tamagotchi from like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I turned it on and immediately started like beeping at me. And you're like, do I feel any sense of sadness that I killed this thing because I didn't interact with it? And it's so funny because no, like those things are discarded everywhere. It isn't a permanent relationship that we took with us.
And I had never before considered the idea of, well, should we be concerned about that? Like, where kids take care of dolls. You say no.
No, I think we shouldn't.
It's just a thing, right? But we're like experimenting with what it's going to be like in the future. And I love how she connected, like, how will intimacy and empathy change in a world where we give toddlers, baby bouncers, and potty trainers with a slot and a tablet or a smartphone?
Yeah.
Like if we're immediately putting technology in front of kids, will that change how they grow up and be empathetic and learn
I
connection?
don't know if it changes empathy or anything, but I do think it rewires your brain. Anything you interact with at a younger age wires your brain in a certain direction or a certain way. And it's not that stuff can't be undone or redone or repaved over, but it is certainly like one thing to think about. I do think that sometimes this is a little overblown because you remember dolls and Barbies, and it's not like you also cut your precious baby's hair off when they were 2 years old and drew marker on their faces. You just didn't do that, right? Like your human child, you did not treat as one of your baby dolls. You did not, in my husband's case, bury it in the backyard and forget that you left it there, right? It's just not a thing that you did with a human child. And so I do think that there's something interesting about interacting with a technology toy or a technology experience in that way that allows you to try things out that you wouldn't try on a human or like kind of understand. You're like, oh, well, that didn't feel good necessarily to do that to this toy, or now I don't really want to play with it. It's got marker all over it. I do think that our interactions with technology and robots can be kind of a similar way. And I don't know if I necessarily like that. I don't want to develop empathy for a robot. I think that gets us into trouble. I'm like, I'm a Battlestar Galactica person. Like, let's not treat these things like they're human. They're not.
I love it because when you say Battlestar Galactica, I know exactly what you're talking about because it's a great series, especially the reboot. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. But it brings up these ideas that they talk about right from the get-go of the book of we have this moment. It's happening. The train's already left off the station. But we have control about how we look at it. And we should be
Absolutely.
a little bit more intentional about the impact of technology on our relationships and what we're asking it to do.
Yeah.
What is actually happening, what we thought would happen. I love she brings up Sherry Turkle in the book Alone Together. Do we just want to feel more in control of relationships?
Yeah,
Is
I
a
think that's
robot
a thing.
better than nothing, or does it have to be better than something?
Yeah. This is the tricky thing, right? Because I do think it's hard for people. Relationships are hard. Maintaining relationships over time, it's hard.
And some people
And it's harder even for some people than others. And so I understand this idea of, if I had a robot girlfriend or if I had a robot caregiver, because my kids don't talk to me anymore, there's this thing that does care about me, that does watch for me, but it doesn't, right? Like we as humans are filling in that gap of what we want from the other person. And it's so much easier with a technology item versus a human, because you and I have been friends for a long time. I can't assume that you are going to provide the level of care or part of the relationship that I may want. Like that's such a human experience. Such a human experience, right? But when you're talking about a robot, you're making up that side of the relationship. They are not filled with empathy. They mirror the empathy that they are provided or that they are programmed on. And maybe that's better than absolutely nothing. I can see cases where, she talks in the book about, elderly people who just want something to care for that isn't necessarily a living thing that could be harmed by somebody who doesn't remember to feed it or, care for it in that way, but is providing that sort of neural empathy and something for them to care for that they don't have in another way. I really see that. I struggle with it, multiplying that across other relationships and having it affect people's either ability or willingness to engage with the people around them.
Right. And we're seeing that when you like mindlessly sort of scroll. It's like we know we're looking for something, but we don't even know what we're looking for. And this is something that Sherry kind of anticipated and was able to sort of see that would it was kind of the trend, like what are our expectations of technology, and are we being really intentional about how we are forming relationships and nurturing them, or are we being unrealistic in our expectations?
I mean, I do think that we're unrealistic in our expectations for technology, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, that it will replace as much as we fear that it will replace. Because ultimately we're like these human creatures who crave that connection with each other. And we saw that in the middle of the worst of the pandemic. Like we had all the technology in the world and it was not the same as seeing people, being in the same place as people, feeling that exchange of chemical reactions.
Even seeing people's faces.
It was just not the same thing. And we all felt it really deeply, I think. And that's why I think sometimes it's a little overblown. Are you going to have edge cases where people don't engage with human relationships? 100%. You've always had those people that, struggle with it and find alternate ways of trying to fill that hole in their lives. But I think especially as parents, it's that idea of helping to teach kids what's real and what's not in a relationship. What is being mirrored to you because it's a technology, and and you're making up that difference versus the relationship you have with a human that can be messy, but so much more rewarding.
I think that's very well said. I really appreciate that perspective. I think, and Sherry proposes that the better and more nuanced technology gets at mirroring human emotion, we're going to be able to fool ourselves into thinking, oh, you're just as real as my friend. I mean, we already, to some extent,
you say thank you
already
to
doing
your
it.
Alexa?
I do.
Are you kidding? First of all, I don't have an Alexa. Are you kidding me? I'm not putting a robot in my house.
You really don't have
I
one?
really don't have an Alexa. Are you? No. And that's, I'm like, I don't need something.
Get rid of mine? No, I'm like, Carina, I really respect what you think. Really?
Yeah, somebody gave me like a dot.
I just love it for
little
music.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. No. I have smart speakers and I have not hooked them up to the robot. Because I understand how that stuff works, and I understand that there are pieces that are like that robot is always listening to you, and I don't know how much of that is being recorded and held in a database someplace to sell me socks later, and I just don't need it. So
You're right.
I am putting a little bit of
said
friction
too
in
much,
there.
especially in my home. I get real
That's
mad
the
at
thing.
Alexa too.
I
and
don't
I think,
thank Siri and I don't think, Alexa. They're robots.
I always try to have good manners because
Yeah, no.
when there are
They aren't real.
overlords, I want them
It's
to give me a
not
good work
real.
assignment. I know. I don't know. I love that we in these chapters in Alone Together and the Nearest Neighbor, and when it talks about being alive enough, and then it showed in the book so many stories about how kids love their robot and work for that love.
Yeah.
And the question is if a robot makes you love it, is it alive? It's kind of like, the Velveteen Rabbit kind of
I
thing.
know.
When you're a kid and you really did think that your baby doll was alive or whatever.
Yeah.
Or your stuffed animal and it was like a member of the family. And that kind of love and connection is what we're talking about. Does it matter if it's a robot or not? Is it something that you will carry into adulthood? It's an interesting question. But the real question that I wanted to ask you was relationships with robots are ramping up. Relationships with people are ramping down. And Sherry says, what roads are we traveling? Does it serve our human purposes? Do you think that the way that technology is being marketed and has developed, especially after the publishing of this book, are we headed in the right direction? What do you think?
It's really hard to say, are we headed in the right direction as much as we're headed in a direction.
Yeah, what
are
road?
Are we prepared for the direction in which we are essentially taking ourselves by opting into consuming this stuff because it makes our lives easier, because it decreases our friction points? And are we trading that convenience for something that's maybe essentially human? And maybe we are. And are we prepared to give that up?
Well, that's the thing. It's this
I don't know.
double-edged sword. I can say no, face-to-face is better. But I have my phone with me all the time.
Sure.
I text more than, and I don't call anybody.
Yeah.
And
I mean, imagine calling someone.
Well, I did the other day, and I just had to apologize profusely. I'm so sorry for calling you on the phone, but I had, it was kind of an emergency, but not really, but whatever.
We should be making more phone calls.
Don't you kind of like, when the phone rings, don't you go, oh, the audacity? Like when the phone rings.
I could be doing something.
How dare you? And so that road we're already down the road. I have this sort of, when I was reading these first two chapters and I was thinking about like Eliza and I thought, oh yeah, this is just like for kids. I had this creeping realization that we're doing it. We just don't have a face to the robot yet.
Yes.
And it's probably coming.
Yeah.
And Siri and Alexa, sorry to say that out loud because I'm sure I just triggered anybody who's watching it. It is widespread enough that people are comfortable bringing it into its home. And that road, I'm always afraid that because I can't anticipate where technology is going, that I find myself in the middle of a road and it's too late to turn back. It sort of seems a little
Listen, this is one thing, it's never too late to turn back. It's never too late to say, you know what, I'm just going to put this down. Or, you know what, I'm going to turn that off. And the best thing about robots is you just unplug them if you are tired of them. It just...
we need to be more concerned with electrical shutdown.
Yeah, unplug it. Just do it. So I do think it's less about us being worried for a future and understanding how to guide our children where this is a reality for them. And for so many who can just speak something to a robot and the robot plays a song or orders, a gift or, or is able to pull up the right show or the movie for the child immediately. This is just what their life is. And so for us, it's, I think, helping them articulate the difference between a relationship with something that can only mirror what you give it and the relationships with the people in their lives that really are meaningful to really help them develop as humans and understand that growth comes through those friction points, that growth comes through maintaining relationships, and that is valuable over time. And I don't think we're going to lose that, but I do think it's especially incumbent upon parents to help kids reason through that. Because for so many kids, like the kids in this book who loved their Tamagotchis, loved their Furbies, you are now the parents whose children just speak into a remote and that's how they interact with the world. And I don't think that the Tamagotchi Tamagotchis and the Furbies were the end of mankind, and neither will this stuff be. But
Interesting.
making sure that those relationships are primary and that you value the human that you're talking to and understand that it's not technology and it isn't going to respond the way that you always wanted to or expect, that it can be messy. That's the good stuff. That's the good stuff. That's where we as humans grow.
Well, it's this idea of that if it's harder to work at and harder to earn, that it is more satisfying. To have. Sherry Turkle uses the example of when we used to play with dolls, you had to do all the work. You had to do all the imagining what the doll was saying and doing and the scenarios. And I just think about playing with Barbies and things like that. And you have to give them dialogues and storylines and all of that kind of thing. And the worry she just kind of proposes is that with a lot of these kind of toys that talk back, that are like robots, that are like the technology or even social media, games and things like that kids are on, it does a lot of that for them, that they're not developing that kind of storyline. It's not as hard won.
Yeah.
And some of it speaks to, in my day, which I relate to, and idealizing a past that is never going to be able to be recaptured again. But part of it talks to, let's just be sure that we are setting up a system where we are, we think that it's valuable to have this creative pursuit and to get into the messy of relationships because that's satisfying because we have the life experience for that. But what about these kids who maybe don't have the experience?
I have an unwavering belief in the power of human imagination and creativity. Like, this is the thing that sets us apart from the robots that we program. And no matter what we program into a robot, as far as creativity and imagination, they are never as good as a human. It just isn't. So I do think that it's overblown. It's not like you're sitting there thinking about the terrible things that you did to your Barbie 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Now that you bring it up.
Maybe you do owe some apologies all the way around.
Yeah, maybe I do.
Maybe you do. But it is different. It's not better. It's not worse. It's just different. And the kids evolve and they still retain the humanness. I mean, we have allergies at our house, and we had a robot cat for a while, and I think the kids thought it was going to be the answer to all their dreams. They finally get a cat. Guess what? I haven't seen that cat in years.
Same.
It lasted like maybe 2 months.
I have
you
the
didn't plug
same
it in.
story. Yeah,
you didn't,
and it's in some drawer.
It's in some drawer, right? I don't think that we should be worried about that. I think we should be excited to see what our kids do with that understanding of what a robot is and what they are, which is different.
I appreciate you bringing up that perspective because I don't want it to seem like that this book is like gloom and doom because I don't think that it is. I really do think that it's just laying this out and having a better the reason why I like this book so much is because it does just lay it out like this is what's happening and all I'm saying is this the road do we want this? Because we still have control over what we want. We can consume it or not and create it. We can change it. And there has to be these points of evaluation along. But in the chapter and under the subheading Alive Enough, I did think it was interesting that that a lot of these were technology, this is just where we've gone, is designed to give users a sense of progress in teaching it, right? Mm-hmm. And just that if you tortured an animal, you would. That's not good. It's don't do that.
Red flag. I'm going to say red flag.
Send you to the school psychologist. Rightfully so, right? But if you torture a robot or a doll, it's not the same thing. We all sort of swung our Barbies around by their head or whatever. Yeah. And you wouldn't do that with something that's alive. And so as robots become more sophisticated and be more real life or lifelike, there may be a tipping point where that it does cross over into the dangerous because kids will have a more difficult time being able to distinguish between an object and something that's real than adults.
Yeah, that line
and it was
becomes
just
a lot closer.
that idea of desensitization, especially in video games. If you're designed to just kill inanimate objects or the virtual, you kind of come desensitized to it. And it makes it a little bit easier. This is the whole argument with video games and violent video games and things like that. But there is it's just a moment of pause of, okay, so how far along as this technology gets more and more real and the lines are blurred, do we have a different responsibility?
This is fascinating because, again, I come down on the side of like robots are robots and we do not need to treat them with the kind of respect that you treat a human. 100%.
But
okay?
people will.
Yes. I mean, we have that instinct to care and, to take care of something that is put in front of us and put into our hands. And that's incredible. That's what makes us human, right? But I like that Sherry brought up that some designers of products figured out that there are essentially some ways that perhaps if you mistreated a robot toy or a robot, if you mistreated a robot toy in a certain way, it would turn off, kind of signaling to kids that like, you can't treat something like this, and then it stops functioning, which is maybe a really valuable segue to like a human relationship. Mm-hmm. If you turn something upside down and shake it, it doesn't want to be friends with you anymore. And like
the cat runs away.
The cat runs away.
And you try to put it in a baby doll dress, just hypothetically.
Like
somebody did that.
There's nothing like a cat to teach you consent, right?
Yeah.
Just what is okay and what isn't. Yep. And I think that is something that we can ask for and demand in the toys and the consumer products that we bring into our lives, is that level of thought and care at the product design level to make sure that, okay, if you mistreat something, maybe it turns off, or like this doll is not functional anymore. And that's something we as consumers can control. We can, specifically buy those things versus the other things.
And I appreciate you saying that, because Sherry does say we do have the control. And this is where we sort of end in this beginning section. And I appreciate your thoughts so much, Carina. Thank you so much for being here and giving a very informed and positive view of how we're starting, not just in the book of where we're going with technology, but also in the human race and where we're headed. I appreciate your optimism.
Look,
with what we
fun
have in
things
control.
are coming. Fun things are coming.
Fun things are coming. Fun things are coming.
Yeah,
and especially here. So thank you so much for watching the Lisa Show Book Club. Fun things are coming. We have been talking to Carina for our part 1, covering chapters 1 and 2 on our series with Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together, which is what we're reading for this series. And make sure that you join us next week as we dive right into part 2, covering chapters 3 and 4 of Alone Together.